Welcome to Boston Children's Answers Parentcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Arnold. As a doctor and a mom, I'm passionate about helping kids stay happy and healthy. So join me as I chat with other Boston children's experts to find answers for you and your family. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Boston Children's Answers Parentcast. Today we're talking about an important topic, that of clinical research and specifically clinical trials. Something that may sound intimidating until you learn more about it, and that's what we're going to do today. As always, let's start with a question from our guest parent.
Hi, I'm Jessie. Our daughter has a rare condition, and we've heard about a clinical trial. What questions should we be asking to decide?
Jessie, that's a really great question. Clinical trials are a great way to help us study and evaluate treatments for kids, particularly with rare disorders. I am so excited to share with you today that we have an expert to talk about this, Dr. Rachael Grace. She is a hematologist and also researcher at Dana-Farber Boston Children's Cancer and Blood Disorders Center. Thanks, Dr. Grace, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, as we start off, I always love to know a little bit about each of our guest experts. And, you are a clinician and a researcher. And here at Boston Children's, we have so many researchers. So I'd love to hear your story about how you got into your field.
I think I was always interested in a career in healthcare. And for as long as I can remember, I wanted a role in keeping children healthy in particular. And through my medical education, I realized that there are so many questions that we don't have satisfactory answers to. Why do children get certain diseases? How do we monitor for complications and make sure that they don't happen? How do we pick among treatments for an individual patient? And why don't we have better treatments for certain conditions? And it was in encountering these questions and being frustrated by not having satisfactory answer to these questions that I became interested in clinical research. And I really have maintained that interest and have grown that interest in clinical research over time because I think it's really important to be part of answering those questions and improving the care and outcomes for children that we take care of.
I don't do clinical research. I do other types of research, mostly in the education simulation space. But without research, we are not going to find new treatments, new cures, ones that are effective and safe. I'm guessing most of our audience doesn't really have a sense of how research works. And so I was wondering if you could share with us, what is a clinical trial and where it fits into the broader landscape of research?
I think when people think about clinical research, they often think about clinical trials in particular, but there are a lot of different kinds of clinical research. One important kind is observational studies. These are studies where there isn't an intervention, but we look to see what are our outcomes with just standard care over time. So one example of that is a registry study. So people who might have a disease condition enter into a study, and information is collected clinically and then also collected for research over time about what kinds of complications and symptoms come up over time, what are the treatments that are used, and what are the outcomes on those treatments. And we can learn a lot from those kinds of studies. A lot of people are often hearing about blood sampler biomarker studies. That's looking at samples both in healthy individuals and in people who have a disease condition to see maybe what markers we have that might predict risk of developing a certain disease, or in people who have a disease, what risks of symptoms or complications might be predicted by their blood samples or even response to treatment. And then another kind of clinical research study is our clinical trials, and that's where we do have an intervention to look to see, is that intervention better than our standard treatments, and can we improve outcomes, and is that intervention safe?
So it's really sounds so much like a continuum, right? And I have a rare disease, and only recently have we, with the observational studies, so to speak, understood a lot of what can happen or what we should expect to happen, and what are the complications of having certain types of skeletal dysplasias, like myself or my kids. And then the next phase is sort of figuring out what's different in the biology from a child with skeletal dysplasia to a child who doesn't. And then now there are therapies coming out, so which go into the clinical trials. So I think it's really important for parents to understand that it's sort of a continuum, and it really is. We need all of these types of studies.
Exactly right. Each is equally important, and they do build on each other. And you you can't have clinical trials unless you really understand the disease to begin with, which comes from those observational natural history kind of studies.
That's great. So understanding and focusing our talk today about clinical trials, because that's really where new interventions and therapies come out. Can you tell us a little bit about what's different between a clinical trial for an adult and for a kid?
All of the safeguards that are in place for adults are in place for clinical trials in kids too, often with additional safeguards as well. One important difference is that we often are conducting clinical trials in adults before those studies are conducted in children. So we have a lot of information before the clinical trial ever starts in children in terms of the dose that's appropriate for an adult, whether the drug is effective in adults, what are the safety issues that might come up in an adult. And though even with that information, it's incredibly important to still conduct clinical trials in children. And that's because children aren't just little adults, that we actually do need to know information specific to children about the dosing. Children metabolize drugs differently. The dosing sometimes is higher in children than it needs to be in adults. We also need to know whether there are differences in terms of the safety in children than in adults. And also the important outcomes might be different for a child in comparison to adults. It's actually a regulatory requirement, a requirement of the FDA, that pediatric studies are conducted. And that's because we don't want to use adult information and apply that to children. We really want to be doing what's right for children in terms of the way that we prescribe medication and know whether it's safe for individual children.
That just resonates so much because kids are oftentimes from a good perspective, benefiting from the research or having already been in the adult side, but we still have to study them in kids because I love that phrase, kids are not little adults, and they are very different in all aspects of physiology and even the things that they're struggling with. You know, certain diseases might affect kids more than adults, and so it's just all of these factors are important to study in both adults and kids. I love that.
That's right. And I think, too, especially for conditions that somebody might be born with, it's incredibly important to think about these treatments and starting them early. So really understanding whether they're effective and safe and as young of an age as possible is critically important because that's what's going to keep children healthy over the long term.
Yeah. And in fact, a lot of drugs too, right, or therapies, they test them in adults and then they test them in the older children and then they get younger over time. So we have a very stepwise fashion, which also helps with the safety perspective.
Absolutely.
So along those lines, what protections are in place to help keep kids safe through clinical trials?
One important safeguard is at the hospital level, and that's with the institutional review board, the IRB, that we want to make sure that there's a committee of people who look over the protocol, the way that the study is going to be conducted to make sure all the right safeguards are in place. And if they're not in place on the first application to that committee, then that committee recommends changes, and then those safeguards are put into place. And so that's an ethical look at the hospital level. In addition, there's a data safety monitoring board, and for every interventional trial, there's an outside committee that's made up of statisticians, mathematicians, scientists, clinicians who are looking at the data as it's being collected to see, are there safety signals? Do we need to make any changes to the conduct of the study to make sure that it's safe for the people who are involved or continuing to enroll in the study? In addition, there's the kind of national regulatory oversight that happens. That's through the FDA in the U.S. And then I think actually most importantly is on the level of the patient and the family and the principal investigator, the main person conducting the study at the institution. And that's really where the most information is shared with that person who's considering participation in the study. That's in a process that's called informed consent, hearing all about the background that we know about a particular intervention, any safety issues that are known, exactly all the details of how the study is going to be conducted. And that process of sharing information isn't just at the time that you're considering whether or not you want to participate, but even after you decide to participate. That's an active process that goes on over the course of the study, where people hear more information as it's being collected about safety so that you have all the same information as the research team during the entire course of the study. And if you have worries about the study, you have opportunity to ask questions, and you can always come off the study too if you have concerns about it.
Wow, that is a lot of protections. I mean, I think that hopefully helps parents who are considering, participating in a clinical trial for their child to realize that there's a whole sort of infrastructure of protection before you even start a study with the IRB review, which is, there are IRB standards across the country, and each institution has a very comprehensive board that reviews every fine detail. And then during the study, we're monitoring constantly, and then even near the end, right, with the FDA before something maybe goes out more broadly. It just seems like every phase is just this a very robust protection process, which is great, and it's important that we know that.
It's incredibly important. I think it's important for the people who are considering participation, but I think it's important for the research team too. We want to make sure that everything's being conducted in a safe way, and we want to make sure too that the information we're collecting is rigorous and is going to answer the question so that we can help improve outcomes over time.
So important, so reassuring too. So thinking about all of those different aspects of monitoring and safety, there's phases to a clinical trial. Can you help all of us understand really what are those phases and why is each one important?
Definitely. I think it is confusing that there are all these phases. These phases are in place to make sure that the study of drugs or investigational devices doesn't continue if there are safety issues or it doesn't look like it's going to be effective. And the goal is to try, to expose as few people as possible to different medications if there's uncertainty about whether it's safe and effective. It's important to understand before you even get to the phases of clinical trials, there are years of studies that happen for any investigational drug, and that actually most drugs that have been investigated in the lab setting never get to a patient because of all the rigor that's done in advance of ever having being given to a person.
So we don't just come up with some idea like, oh, let's try this.
This might work. Exactly. So it's studied carefully in the test tube setting, in the basic lab setting, and then studied in animals and animal models of diseases to really look, is it effective, but also are there any safety issues that we should be concerned about before exposing somebody to this? And only once all of those rigorous criteria are met does it get to that first phase, a phase 1 clinical trial. That phase 1 clinical trial happens in the fewest number of people, and it's really to look to see what's the right dose of a certain medication and what are some initial safety issues that we might be seeing. Those phase 1 studies can be in children, but often aren't in children or in adults, and even aren't often in people who have the disease, but are in healthy volunteers where we get this initial information. So for people who really are invested in furthering science. A phase 2 study happens once that phase 1 study shows what the appropriate drug dose is based on drug levels, and the safety issues are known. And in a phase 2 study, there are more people, but it's still often a very small study, and that's a study to look to see is the drug safe, but also is there any signal that it might be effective too. And if that is seen, then the drug moves on to what's called a phase 3 trial. A phase 3 trial is in a larger number of people looking to compare how does the intervention look compared to our usual treatments, our standard treatments. So now you have a comparison, which is why you need more people as part of that study. And that's the study that's going to show, is this intervention better than our standard treatment?
Standard care.
And if it's better, that's when a drug might go to the regulatory agency, the FDA, to see should this be approved so that it can be prescribed to patients. Once that happens, actually the study's still not over because once the drug starts to be prescribed in the real world setting, there's what's called a phase 4 study that looks to see how is it effective in the real world setting, being prescribed to many more people, and are there other safety signals that we're seeing now that there's even more people receiving the drug, and should we have any changes in terms of the monitoring for those kinds of issues.
Yeah, and I imagine that for a lot of folks, who are following, health news related to new medications or treatments, they're hearing a lot about the phase 3, right? Because that's the larger group. We're comparing it to whatever the current standard of treatment is, if there is one, or a placebo, right? And we can talk a little bit about placebos, but we're really trying to see, does it have an impact in those patients that we want it to have an impact? And that's really, I think, where we hear a lot about research.
That's right. So in public media, we're often hearing when we hear about different new developments, it's in a phase 3 setting.
Yeah, but people should all know that there is a lot of research that's happened before
right.
you get to that point.
That goes right. That's right. Years and years of studies.
Yeah, that's really great. And it's important for all of us to know because research is how we make new treatments to help us to keep us healthy.
Absolutely.
So having said that, about how long is each phase? In particular, phase 3, where it's such a large group, do you have a sense of how long most trials take by phase?
The number of patients needed to be able to conduct the study and answer the question is different depending on the rarity of the condition that's being studied. So sometimes in a rare disease, it can take a while to enroll everybody who's needed for a study, but also sometimes in a rare disease, it's a very enthusiastic population that may not have other treatment options and is excited for a new development. And so occasionally that enrolls very quickly. Exactly. So there's some unpredictableness to how quickly some of the trials will enroll. But phase 1 trials involve fewer people, and phase 3 trials are much larger. Because of the kinds of questions that need to be answered, the number of weeks that people are involved or days involved on the study differs, and the phase 3 studies usually take the longer period of time. Phase 3 trials are often a little bit of a different design too. You had mentioned about a placebo. So some of the designs of the trials is to compare an intervention to a non-intervention. So something that looks like the drug, but actually it is like a sugar pill, isn't the drug. And that's really important to understand. Is what we're doing better than not doing anything instead? And sometimes you think you understand that without a placebo, but actually because the natural history of a disease is not always well understood, as we were talking about earlier, that placebo arm is important to understand, actually, is this better, or the side effects, actually complications of the disease itself, and they're not different between the drug arm and the placebo arm. What we see with the phase 3 trials, though, there's often a phase where you switch over to being able to get the drug, even if you might have originally been assigned to be getting the placebo, or there's what's called an open label part of the study where everybody gets access to the drug. And so that also can make the study a little bit longer because you wait to the time where everybody who's on the trials is getting the drug.
Yeah, so you're really doing your study, and then you're saying, okay, now if you were on a placebo, you or everyone can have access to the medication or the therapeutic or the drug, after that study period, essentially, right? You're still in the study period, but you're now offering it to everybody.
Right, that there's a flip over time that happens after a certain number of days or weeks, and then everybody can have access.
When I want to kind of point out one thing that you mentioned in that phase 3 trial, aside from maybe the specifics of the treatment and how long you need to watch it, the timing factor, really a lot of that is related to getting enough people enrolled to get enough data. And I think, a lot of folks are worried when a new medication comes out and it was like a fast time, right? We think about the COVID vaccine, warp speed. They created this new vaccine and people were worried, well, was it studied enough? But we had so much interest in evaluating that vaccine and saving lives that we got the number of people we needed to study it much more quickly than maybe we typically do in other vaccines. Is that a fair assessment? It's really about the numbers as opposed to the time that helps us to know if a new treatment is effective and safe? That's right. So the design of the trial is the same. Regardless of how quickly it enrolls, the conduct of the study is going to be the same. And so if people are enthusiastic about participation, it will enroll quickly. And if it needs a lot of people to participate, even when there's enthusiasm, sometimes it takes a bit of time to get everybody in on the trial. Yeah, so it's less about like how long it's been out or studied versus did we get enough people to get the right information? Right. And I would say we are excited when studies enroll quickly because we're going to get to the answer faster, but it doesn't have to do with the actual conduct of the trial. It's just that enrollment time. Can you tell me a little bit about, how you look at data within each phase so that you have meaningful outcomes and you sort of have good answers to your questions? It's important to make sure that we know exactly the number of people that need to enroll in a study to be able to answer the question. And that number is calculated in advance of the trial opening. And it's based on what we know about the disease and what we know about the outcome that's being studied to be able to estimate the number of people that we need to participate.
An important part of the study, though, too, in addition to the number of people that participate, is the rigor of the data that's being collected, because you could have enough people, but if the data aren't collected rigorously, you don't have all the information about all those people. So we really need to make sure that everybody who's participating is actually taking the intervention, is coming for the study visits, that the information that's being asked is being collected at those and entered into the database. And the data are closely monitored for the study to make sure that we're collecting that information and that everything is being double checked to make sure that everything's entered correctly as well.
Yeah, because really that data is how we're able to evaluate a new therapy as safe and effective. So thinking about that too, related to data, getting enough data, can you tell us a little bit about trials either being in one institution or multiple institutions and how that also helps us with data?
Some studies, the entire trial or observational study registry could be open at a single center, but I would say in pediatrics in particular, most studies are multicenter, and that means that the same study is open at different institutions and different hospitals. And that's because oftentimes we need more people to participate than can be obtained at just a single center. And that means, though, too, that the exact same study is being conducted at these different institutions. So it's really like following a recipe when you try to conduct a clinical trial, that you really have to follow the directions to a T to make sure that everybody who enrolls on the trial meets all the criteria for being participants, and that we're collecting the exact same data at the exact same time points, even though we're from different institutions. Even though studies may be open at multiple institutions in this multi-center way, it doesn't mean that it's accessible or easily accessible for everybody. And for pediatric trials, they're often not open everywhere. So for some people who want to participate, they may still need to travel to an institution that has the study open. And this may mean, too, being partially cared for by a different team than your primary medical team, which I think is challenging for families that are thinking about participating, and creates some barriers sometimes to being able to participate.
That could be a huge burden, I can imagine, for families to be able to travel. I mean, I'm thinking about my own experience. There were trials for a new therapeutic for achondroplasia, and we were, considering it, interested in it, but we didn't have anyone local to us at the time. And get that, that's extra expense and whatnot.
Right.
Now, the benefit of clinical trials, they usually help cover a lot of the expenses, though, I understand. Is that typically true to help families?
Yes. So
that's important.
The study itself often helps with those logistical details.
Yes.
So figuring out both, how are you going to get to the study center? How long do you have to be there? How often would you have to come back and forth? Helping to support a night in a hotel if that's needed, helping with the travel arrangements and the cost of travel. I think it should not be that the study actually costs a family something to participate.
Exactly.
There are sort of the unseen costs, though, time away from work or time away from school, time away from home, and maybe the rest of the household that's not coming to the visits. So I think the study team in the hospital has a lot of supports in place. There are often, a social work team, and other, patient support teams to help people with participation, even when they live local to the center, but especially when they're coming from afar. And so there are all those supports there to help facilitate participation, but it still is a big decision for a family.
Yeah. That makes a big difference, I'm sure, for families. And, from a research perspective, I imagine that having it multi-center, which, again, as you mentioned, most pediatric trials are, that it allows us to really be sure that, there aren't geographical differences in how a new treatment might work. So that really does help us to have better answers.
That's exactly right, too. And I think, the many of the interventional trials, the studies of new medications, are global trials. They're happening internationally with many different patient populations and different kinds of settings. And so that also helps with the interpretation and sort of the broad implications of the findings as well.
That's great. All goes back to the data so that we can have good, meaningful treatments. That's great. We talked a lot about how clinical trials work and the importance of data and the process and safety. Are there any myths you want to sort of dispel for our audience about clinical trials in pediatrics?
Yes, I think people have a lot of misconceptions about research. People have a lot of worries about research. One, I think that comes up a fair amount is that families don't want their child to be like a guinea pig, something being experimented on, I think is the concern. And as we had talked about, there are lots of safeguards in place, and we always have the child in mind when we're thinking about research, especially for clinical trials where there's an intervention, and it's always with a lot of thought that we're considering whether a child should be a candidate for a given clinical trial. I think, too, families worry if you're offering clinical research or offering participation in a clinical trial that maybe you think that things aren't going well or that our usual treatments aren't working. But it may be because you think that there's something even better than what's being done, and that's why you're offering a clinical trial. I think people are sometimes worried about their privacy. They don't want their information shared in a way, or to have their family's information somehow shared in a way. And we have a lot of systems in place to protect people's privacy. Anyone who participates in research is assigned a code, a study ID it's called. And when any information is shared outside of the institution, outside of Boston Children's Hospital, for example, that person is referred to only by their study ID, so that nobody knows who that person is, and there's not personal health information being shared outside of the institution.
Hopefully sharing some of these myths will help folks to feel a little bit more comfortable about it. We've participated in them, both my kids and my family.
It is important to really think through whether it's right for you and your family. One thing that I tell every family is to ask a lot of questions, that there are no bad questions, that you should make sure to invite people who can think of those questions with you to be a part of that consent discussion that I mentioned earlier, and that you shouldn't feel at all rushed to make a decision, that you can make a decision over time. I think it's important to think through all the logistics that we were just talking about, and how is this going to impact your everyday? Can you actually make it to all these study visits? Are you going to be able to do everything that's being asked of you during the course of the study? I think because children are an important part of the decision making, they need to understand what is being asked of them too. And we think about the process of assent. That's really getting permission from the child. Having them understand what we're talking about. We feel like probably around the age of 8 or so, kids can understand what we're talking about, that it may be in a more simplified way, but they should be a part of the decision-making and understanding process too.
Yeah.
And so I think those are all important considerations when families are thinking about a trial. I think the last thing I would mention too is that particularly when there's an intervention, is that we don't know if it's going to be effective, and we definitely don't know if it's going to be effective for your child. And so there's a question as part of research that you have to be comfortable with, that we're looking to see, is this effective in your child? Is this safe in your child? But that if we already knew the answer, we would be able to prescribe that intervention. And so you have to feel comfortable with that, a little bit of the unknown.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's really important for all families who are considering it, to understand that big picture and the safety piece and the details. But I also understand that the care, right, it can sometimes feel very supported if a family does. So say a family does, decide, yes, I want to participate in this trial. What does that look like for an individual family? What are the benefits, or what are the downsides?
I think there are the potential for both. If it's an interventional trial, there is the potential for benefit. We hope that intervention is effective. That there may be no other treatments, and we hope that this is going to be a treatment that is effective, or there may not be treatments that are as well tolerated or as effective as we wish they were in an individual person, and we hope this is better than that. Your care is amazing on a clinical trial because you have a team that is very attuned with all your needs. They want to hear about everything going on, any symptom, any issues that arise. The research team wants to know, and it's often a much bigger team than your traditional medical team or clinical team. You also have the potential to help further science. Yeah. That's a reason that people do participate, is they want better outcomes for other people too in the future, in addition to their own family. But I think there are downsides, that this is a lot more involved than usual care. Mm-hmm. You'll have more visits, that it's more time in the care setting for your family. and that there's unknowns about the intervention that are being studied. Usually we have data from adults like we talked about, so it's with a lot of information going in, but there are questions about the effectiveness and the safety in children that are being studied. And so there could be potential downsides in terms of the intervention not being effective or maybe having a side effect.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. Families, even sometimes because they get such close care, it's almost hard when they go off the trial, they miss the team that they were so closely working with. And I can only imagine that one of the other benefits might be too is as part of that team, you really do get a lot of care from experts, right? If you're a clinician involved in a trial, that's because this is an area of focus for you and your work. And so you get to interact and get a lot of good advice just from the experts in that area.
Definitely. And although people could come for a second opinion with the expert, it is a way for that expert to get to know your family and your child on an individual level. Yeah. And even after the trial ends, to potentially have the opportunity to continue that relationship too.
That's great. For families, seriously wanting to know, what does this really look like on a day-to-day basis? Like, how is this different than other medical appointments?
I think that the care can be similar in some ways to routine clinical care, but it's different in other ways. It's important during a clinical trial that we do exactly what the protocol, what the directions say for how the study needs to be conducted. And so that means seeing your study team on a regular basis on specific days that are asked of you by the study team. And specific tests and monitoring are needed over the course of the study, also at specific times. So whereas in clinical care, we might say, we don't need to get labs that day, or we'll skip them this time, or maybe we
come back in a month.
We could wait 3 weeks. And in a clinical trial, you have to do all of these tests exactly when it says they need to be done, and that's so that the data are collected on every child in the exact same way over multiple centers, so that the results are interpretable. So that part of things is different because it's much more at set intervals and with set tests. The other another difference is just who's on your team. That in your clinical care, in a research study, you have a very large team that's keeping really close tabs on you, because the research team wants to know everything that goes on over the course of the study, any symptom you have, any issue with the medication or survey studies or things that need to be conducted at home, that the team wants to know all those details, and you'll be seeing all of those team members when you come in for your visits. The logistics also are worked out by the study team, and that's different than clinical care, where you're trying to make your appointments and figure out what needs to be done kind of on your own. During a research study, the study team helps to figure out all those logistics for you, so that they tell you where you need to be and which days, but that you're not trying to sort out all the details.
That sounds lovely to a very busy mom who's trying to coordinate care for her kids. It sounds great.
So I think that there's more involved, but that there's you're supported in a different way, and there's a lot of supports in the hospital system to help people during the course of participating in research, and that includes social workers, patient support team members. Really trying to make sure that things are as easy as possible for families, and if any issues arise, that we're helping to address those quickly.
It's a different process, but in many ways, it's a more comprehensive process of care compared to what your regular medical appointment or medical care might look like.
Definitely,
which is kind of neat from my perspective. I think especially when you have kids with medical complexities or, rare diseases, like that's kind of a struggle for many families, and to sort of feel like you've got a team that's really looking out for all of those aspects in your care is great.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the fact that eligibility is not necessarily guaranteed. So can you talk to us a little bit about how eligibility is determined to participate?
Yes, definitely. And I think too, just to start by saying, even if your clinician talks about research or the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, that it's always a choice whether to participate, that it's a voluntary process, and that your care is never compromised or different. The clinician taking care of you is happy either way, but wants you to know about the different options.
Absolutely.
That your clinician may discuss a clinical trial in thinking that you might be eligible, but there are strict inclusion and exclusion criteria for participation in a trial, and those are set up to make sure that the people who participate in the trial are all similar in some ways to make sure that the results are interpretable. And so that's making sure that everybody potentially has the exact same diagnosis, and understanding, are there other things going on with that individual person that may make this a less safe option for them? Are there other medical issues where this intervention might not be the best for that person? So really thinking through diagnostic information, but also sometimes screening tests are done after somebody signs up to participate in a trial to determine whether they're eligible. And sometimes you're not eligible to participate, but hopefully there'll be a study in the future where you might be.
A lot of careful thought and rigor really goes into developing these trials and making sure that we're getting the appropriate individuals to participate. How can a family look for trials that their child may be eligible for?
I think this is such an important question because the answer, the information isn't that easy to access sometimes, and for some individuals. I think always starting with your specialist and to find out what they know about different clinical trials that might be open now or might be coming soon. I think that's a good place to start. It also is information that might be available on the hospital website or the hospital's research website, looking to see, are there clinical trials in the disease that you're interested in. Another place to look, which is not very user-friendly, is a website called clinicaltrials.gov. That clinical trials it's a mandate that they be entered into this website. And you can search by different disease conditions to see, is there a clinical trial in a specific disease condition? Often there's multiple that you can find on that website, but the way the information is laid out is more for medical providers than it is for people interested in participating, but it is a way to see that information. And then I think another really important place to find information is through patient groups that they often are working really hard to get that information out. So looking on their websites or calling the people who are in charge of those patient groups to find out, are there clinical trials and what are the locations of those trials, to try to find out more information.
Clinicaltrials.gov it's exciting that we have a place where we know everything is there, because otherwise it would be like probably finding a needle in a haystack. But putting all of those pieces together, your community with others that may share a similar condition, and your own clinician, your own doctors, and then of course looking at this website, I feel like it's unlikely to miss any opportunities out there with those if you follow those rules. I think so. That's really great. What practical tips do you have for those that are about to start in a trial to help them prepare, both the parents and help the parents prepare their kids?
I think understanding all of the different aspects of the study before it starts is really important. What are all the study visits? What's going to happen at those visits? And even asking the person who's telling you about the study for like a play-by-play of what to expect. I think that's really helpful, because I think that it can be stressful at the very start when you're not sure, if you're not sure about what's going to happen when you get there. Are you going to need to get blood drawn? Do you need a radiology test? Who's going to see you at the visit? I think once you're in the study, there is predictability to it, and you know the people and get a sense of what's going to happen. But I think especially at the start, having a good understanding before that first day about what to expect really helps both the parents and the child, so that they're not nervous for that first visit.
That's great. Yeah, and many children's hospitals that do engage in clinical trials, right? And they even have sort of like either outpatient or even inpatient units that are really dedicated towards caring for kids that are in a trial, which probably allows a little bit of a sense of extra care.
That's right.
And sort of being in a place where everyone else is dealing with similar situation as you are.
That's right. And that's definitely true here at Boston Children's.
That's great. Dr. Grace, this is usually the part of the conversation where we talk about research. And the cool thing is this whole podcast has been about research. But I am curious, what are the clinical trials that either you're involved in or that you are very excited about?
I think I've had the opportunity to be involved in a lot of exciting clinical research and clinical trials. I think in hematology and blood disorders, where my clinical focus is, we've had this explosion of really exciting new developments over the last 10 years, and really with an interest in children and pediatrics, which is incredibly exciting. So it's almost hard to pick what's the most exciting, but I would say that one area that I've been very involved in is in a very rare anemia called pyruvate kinase deficiency. It's a red cell disorder where which is genetic, that kids are born with this disorder where red cells fall apart more easily, and children become anemic, but also have a lot of complications related to those to the red cells. And then it's a disease through a lifetime. And previously there were no disease-directed treatments for people with this anemia. And so about 10 years ago, we developed here at Boston Children's an international registry for people who have pyruvate kinase deficiency, a natural history study. And through that, understood the symptoms, the complications, the kinds of supportive treatment people were getting to understand what happens over time. And through that natural history study, clinical trials were developed for a novel oral pyruvate kinase activator, so medicine people could take by mouth that would really target the underlying problem in people with this anemia. And we had the adult trials open here, and that drug was shown to be safe and effective in a significant subset of patients, and the drug went on to be approved for adults, representing the first treatment for people with this anemia that's disease-directed. And now we have the pediatric trials open here, and I hope, because we have seen now too that the drug is effective and safe in children, that it will be approved for kids. And what's also exciting about this drug is it seems to be effective in other red cell disorders too. And so now it's also been studied in thalassemia and sickle cell and other rare anemias that we see in our hematology practice, representing really a new kind of treatment for people with different kinds of anemia. So that's been incredibly exciting to be a part of. And as there's been more data and more treatments, then there's been this build of a patient voice too, which has been incredibly exciting.
What I love so much about that example that you shared. I think, first of all, obviously it's your passion and you're making a huge difference for this population. But what I also thought was just a really important point is that you never know how many others, more broadly, understanding that therapy might help others with similar conditions. And that's what's so exciting about research, is it just kind of builds upon itself and helps to improve health outcomes. It saves lives.
Absolutely. And it's remarkable when that happens, really.
That's really an awesome story. Thank you for sharing. I want to make sure, is there anything that we haven't discussed that you want to make sure our audience knows about clinical trials?
I think clinical trials are always worth considering, and they're an important way that we learn about new treatments and whether they're going to change outcomes for patients. But that people shouldn't feel badly if they choose not to participate, that it's a voluntary choice that is worthy of consideration.
We all have to make the decision that's best for us and for our family, our kids. I love that. Well, it is exciting what clinical trials can do, though, for all of our health. And so as we near the end here, this is the part of the conversation where I love to ask our guest host for a prescription, so to speak. It's called our doctor's orders. And so I'm wondering, related to clinical trials, do you have any doctor's orders for our audience today that might help parents raise healthy, happy kids?
Clinical research is the way that we make medical progress, and I would encourage everybody to think about participation in clinical research, whether you're lucky to be healthy or that you have a disease condition that's followed carefully. The way that we're going to have better outcomes in the future is for everybody to consider research as a way to make progress.
That's really great. Yeah, whether you're healthy or you have a condition, clinical research is really important, and it helps us all. Thank you so much. It's been so fun to have this conversation with you, Dr. Grace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grace, and thank you to Jessie, our guest parent today, and to all of you for tuning in to this month's Boston Children's Answers Parentcast. I hope that this episode really helped you understand more about clinical trials, and in particular, know how to make the best decision for you and your family if you're exploring one. Until next time, thanks so much.